All right, everyone. Welcome to the Stoa, the third session of Jill Nephew's Philosopher-in-Residence series here at the Stoa, Natural Intelligence in Practice. And Jill is a technologist and founder of Inquire, an inquiry technology that makes it possible for individuals and groups to access powerful inquiry processes around any topic. And the idea is to engender natural intelligence with this inquiry tool. And in this third session, I'm going to read a blurb from what she sent me. Jill's going to discuss natural intelligence is the only intelligence that can go beyond winning the game to transcending the game, deconstructing the game, redesigning the game, and creating new games in the midst of unimaginable or every imaginable adversity at lightning speed. Sounds delicious. Sign me up. Yeah, today's going to be similar to last time. We're going to be here for 90 minutes, but the 90 minutes might be a whole presentation. And instead of having like a Q&A portion at the end, which we might have, if there's time, just sprinkle in the questions throughout. So if you have any questions, just pop up the emoji hand. I think that will cue Jill. Jill will be able to spot it, and then she'll just take you in so we can sprinkle in the Q&A throughout the presentation. So yeah, that being said, Jill, welcome back to Stoa.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for all these familiar faces back again. That's great. And I hate to drop it on you, but I've actually changed the frame of this week's talk, and I'm going to postpone again getting to all this action-packed examples to the next talk, because I had so much inbound where people really seemed more excited to actually explore more about looking at systems and models and mapping natural intelligence to existing systems, existing models. So I thought actually I'm going to be focusing on that today. And then the next talk, we will look at more this promise of what does it really look like fully restored in action? Where do we have like a sample of that? And that's where we'll finally get a little more action back. So today is going to be a lot more grounding and a little bit more cerebral grounding into existing systems, but I'm hoping it'll be really helpful for people to see these examples to help clarify what we're talking about and really help them start to get a handle on how to actually really use this in navigating the times we're in, like right now, a little more pragmatic actually, and less visionary of the future we're stepping into. So with that, I guess I should share my screen and jump in. Okay, so as promised, we're going to change things up a little bit here and jump into systems, models, and frameworks through the lens of natural intelligence to try to build up more of this promise of helping you ground more of a sense of what we're talking about, and hopefully bring it into even common sense of what we're referring to, and show real world examples that should be familiar. So I'm going to start again with a recap, and then we're going to go into examples of grounding through models and systems through the lens of natural intelligence. And then I'm going to attempt to present, as someone reached out and asked for, a general framework for how to do this with any system, which I thought was an interesting thing to try to explain. So this will be debuting that strategy to see if I can show my work and show how others can do this themselves. And then we'll talk about democratizing system model framework building, the need for psychological self-reliance, and ethical implications of some of the stuff that I'm going to show. Okay, starting with the recap. So here we go again, a whirlwind, a little bit of repetition just in case people have not seen this material, and get everybody reoriented on what we're building on the last couple of weeks. So basically, the idea that we started with is that there's these two attention systems, and they are designed to coordinate with each other. And we end up in situations where they are not coordinating with each other, but when they are coordinating with each other, you can almost think of it like this familiar analogy of the figure ground, where it's basically two ways of seeing the same thing. It's almost like, what do you bring forth, the foreground or the background? And this coordination is an ability to switch rapidly between the two, and even understand quite intuitively how they are should seamlessly work together. And what happens is that we end up in situations, the problem of the Western world, where that attention gets trapped in one mode, and that creates all kinds of problems, um, and that it becomes a axiomatic problem, a problem in terms of what we can know and what we can show to be true. And we can show that systems made out of these, that when we do this, we trap our attention and create these systems, we can prove axiomatically that these systems cannot really represent reality. And in that sense, we can kind of use this blanket statement of being insane, not reflecting reality. And then we talked about how this is also a model of individual and collective, but we use not so colloquially, but grounding into mental illness and being a signature of that it is not good for our well-being, our mental health, to end up with a trapped attention. And then pointing out the central argument that this is a root vulnerability we have in our attention system to get stuck like this, and that this is basically leading to the crisis where it can be a root cause of all the current crises we're in. So it's kind of our central argument, getting more compressed every time. And then we talked about, as part of this idea, there's levels of cognition that basically with this trapped attention can only leverage these, what Judea Pearl would call these lower rung causal simple models. It's the kind of thing we build algorithms out of, and AI systems and parts to whole. Moving to higher level cognition, represented on the left with the rungs of Judea Pearl, represented on the right as the different types of conceptual blends our minds naturally do, sourced from looking at languaging and cognitive science. These higher level modes of cognition require us to ground into our tacit knowledge, our direct knowledge, things that are impossible, what we and we don't know we know. It's absolutely required to access the things we feel like we're missing: wisdom, and just common sense, and creating a world that makes sense. Things that we recognize, things that make sense, require this higher level cognition. We talked about how that when our attention's trapped, of all these kinds of intelligences we come up with, and I said last time, if you look about 10 years ago, they're still counting them at about 20. I guess now maybe there's double that, 40. I don't know how many there are really, but we keep coming up with these different ideas of how we might measure ourselves and our ability to be intelligent. But if you take all those, there's quite specifically one kind of intelligence, one kind of move, this logical framework, analytic framework, that ties to the trapped attention system. And that is what we're very much dominated with. And when that happens, these other ones get suppressed, and we can see lots of examples of that. And then presumably when we restore it, we restore all these other forms of intelligence that we rely on. And lastly, again, that natural intelligence we're calling a superset, and the superset remains the unquestioned superset, like can never fall from that throne of being the superset, because it has this unusual characteristic that the way you measure it is you take a thing and you put it into the real world and see if it can survive, see if it can live. And that's natural intelligence. And that takes all kinds of abilities that we don't know how to encode and we don't know how to test for. We just know the measure is if you can be dropped into a wild natural environment, well, we evolve into, let's say, find your way through, learn how to integrate with, learn how to adapt to, and enter into all these relationships and interpret your full environment in such a way that you can not only survive, but thrive and reproduce. That takes a kind of intelligence that is the superset. And then we can kind of fit all these other ones into it. And then we started going into, last time, these two forms of inquiry. We're talking about inquiry, the dark side and the light side of inquiry. And we're saying that what inquiry does, quite fundamentally, that the definition of inquiry is to pull things into our cognitive workspace. We're saying that if you are pulling anything into your cognitive workspace, meaning not coming from your senses, right, but you're deciding to pull it in, I'm calling that, definitionally calling that inquiry. And that's saying that we can language around that. And we may be doing it even without languaging it. So when you say, okay, return yourself to like how you're feeling in your body, or the feeling of your big toe, you can choose to place your attention there inquire into it without the languaging, or you can ask yourself, what does my big toe feel like? You can do the languaging form, but if you start to sense into it, you realize it is something's choosing before your attention moves, and that chooser can be languaged or not. And when it's languaged as inquiry. That's how we do it conventionally. So if you look at those forms, all forms of inquiry, we're looking at basically the forms of how we steer each other's attention around. And that's powerful because when you control what people bring into their cognitive workspace, you control the cognitive workspace. So you can choose what to reify. You can bring it in ways that make it tight and unquestioning and hard to challenge. And so basically, when we ask a question, we're asking people to reify into their own cognitive workspace and draw also from their own direct experience. So it's this kind of extra magic. And so basically the little inquiry is this little light beam signals. That's my little symbol for inquiry. And basically, if you want to trap people's attention and reify what I'm calling a confabulatory, what reflects a trapped false causal model, if you limit where they can look to come up for envelopes of plausibility. So we said life moves forward in envelopes of plausibility. If you say your only plausible mechanism I'm going to let you consider are these two things that I'm saying can't be changed, people will make up, or they'll say, well, that might be plausible. So if I say, okay, you weren't paying attention for a second and you crashed into a car. This is an example that happened to me when I was a teenager and I was really tired. And someone said, you ran the red light. I don't explicitly remember the light turning because I've seen 1,000 lights turning. So I thought, well, that's within an envelope of plausibility. It wasn't true. I didn't run a red light, but I agreed to a crime I didn't, I confessed to a crime I didn't commit, running a red light, because everyone had told me what had happened, and that I thought I could imagine an envelope of plausibility where it was true. And then later, as it turns out, I was able to fill in more and I realized, no, it wasn't at all what happened. But in that moment, under all that pressure, you can get somebody to do this. And you can do it so reliably, 95% of people now done artfully will confess in a lab to things they didn't do. So this is very much an ability to trap other people's attention and get them to imagine things that aren't real. And this and kind of add to this and kind of fill it in. I thought it'd be useful. We didn't really get to this last time. I just came up with this. This is not scientific examples. These are just top of mind. I threw together pretty quickly, but you probably can come up with a lot of your own. But I came up with some examples of what that might look like. So there might be, kind of an explosive number of forms of ways to do this. But this is kind of trying to show a little bit about what the form might look like. So, really simple one, why are you X? So you may not believe you are X. Sorry, were you waving me down, Peter? Was there a question? Okay, sorry. You may not necessarily subscribe to that, but in the moment, you may take on that I am this thing X. I realized I went from X and double X, so X and double X is the same thing. So you may soften that, but you're still doing the same reification move. I'm just curious, why are you X? Or I'm just curious why you're being so X. I'm just curious why what being so X is about. So you can see how you're reifying things in ways that's hard to get out of that category, and you're starting to collapse where a person's starting to look. I understand you're so X, and I love you anyway, and I'm just curious how I can help you, heal from being X. The fact that you're, that you X something you're doing shows me that you are Y, some other thing. An implicit question like, oh, does X cause Y? Well, I didn't even agree that I'm Xing or Ying. So you can see how you start doing these magic tricks on attention. When people, and then these can be kind of objectified out when people find themselves, some general metaphor is because they are X. So implicit question, oh, how does that, confabulatory mechanism work in my life? Like assuming that it's true and then projecting it into your life. And this is how these things become parasitic. They start living in us as questions. I know someone that used to do X, this general metaphoric thing, and they realized they were X. And this is And that is why they did some other thing. And so here there's kind of this, oh, maybe that sounds like me. Maybe that's my example. And so now all of a sudden you've got another version of this reified, potentially confabulatory mechanism taking root. X people, X people often do this bad thing. Oh, am I, am I that kind of person? Do I do that thing? Or bad people, label X, often do what you're doing. Oh, am I a bad person? No, gosh, So all these ways we kind of can trap each other's attention into these things. And again, it's where any plausible explanation becomes reified, and then that becomes can easily become a closed loop, and we don't even notice. It just slips in, and that thing can live in us unless it's examined and deconstructed. And this is often this search for any plausible explanation against things that are not allowed to ground into reality. If you just stop there, you could call that a justification system. You could say that we only operate through justification systems. You could say that our minds are untrustworthy because of these justification systems, because you can get people to do this. They're also called rationalizations, confabulations. This is the source of what has been called, I guess, for fun, bullshit in some academic circles. I said this is what spawns these parasitic processes. And again, it's the mechanism for all these really dangerous things. We deal with like false memories, or people remember things that didn't happen, but they're being suggestive, false confessions through cults, where basically people are never allowed to de-reify these things, where there's a lot of social pressure to keep things reified, and they aren't allowed to dissolve or reground into reality. And then you have the situation where these reified confessions are kind of, these utterances in a lab are misinterpreted as truth statements. And then the psyche is implicated as being nonsensical. And this is the whole wealth of why we're strangers to ourselves, why we can't trust our subconscious. Where does all this crazy stuff come from that we're agreeing to? It must be insane. How can we say all this? And all of them suffering this, I'm labeling it as induced confabulation, not the academy, but others have pointed out this is currently uncorrected systematic error in a lot of scientific interpretations that people should be careful about. There's still more science than not that would interpret interpretations this way, that people are untrustworthy, than to say, well, you didn't do the experiment properly, you didn't set up the conditions by which they are allowed to examine, explicate, and fill in what really happened. Were they justifying or not? And we talked about how you can ask people, did you justify, and how this fades away over time and whatnot. So there's kind of this pressure for these things to happen. And then this dissipation, if you are in the right conditions, that can dissipate. And so we are bombarded with these kind of forms, and we internalize them. And they have, you can see as a general form, you can probably start to recognize these general forms that can kind of spawn kind of endless parasitic processes. They're living in us as mechanisms. They can map in an open way into all kinds of things that can set up a way of a general approach towards introspection, or towards being with ourselves, or trying to make sense of our world, that just gets co-opted into a parasitic process and makes it very unpleasant and painful, if it's a painful loop, to be with ourselves. And we talked about the way out is the other form of inquiry, which would be basically, not assuming that the thing itself is reified, and this will become clear later, but allowing that to look around and ground itself and potentially be pulled apart, recontextualized, or effectively like falsified by showing that it's not relevant. That wasn't relevant. It's like waking up from a dream. So we use our relevance through our own common sense, through our own knowledge of what's possible and impossible from our direct experience, to disabuse ourselves of these processes that set up in ourselves through an intentional introspective process, where we intentionally bring things into our cognitive workspace that can do this work on our behalf. And we talked about how we do that. Comes with the territory, comes with our amazing machinery through conceptual blends, that basically we bring the impossible into new contexts, and we know it's relevant, and we create these something new. It's generative, it's a source of insights, a source of innovation. It's also it's our superpower, and it's the source of flow states, revealing envelopes of plausibility. These constraints, when the envelope of plausibility becomes small, the stakes are high. We become very excited that we you just somehow almost like the you can almost imagine like a conservation of mass problem where we have all this possibility in a very tiny narrow thing and really high stakes, and we just get super energized into that emergent envelope of plausibility, so that we actually seek that out as a very alive, livening state. And then we talked about finding these inquiry forms as the crux because they're the ways of looking. They're the seeing Nephews and Robert Bayes framework, if people like that term, but basically it's the looking around that brings into context, that can dissolve or de-reify the things that are falsely reified, or reify something useful, which is the other half of it. They can, new concept creation, insight, new ways forward, aha moments can often reify something very useful, something we want to remember, something we want to bring back to mind, a way forward, or help a recognition of something, help bring the foreground out from the background just as much as it can dissolve the foreground into the background. It can work both ways. And then we asked, like, can we count these? Can we look for these? And then I argued that language, actually, if you just look at the structure of language, there's all this support that says it should be possible, because we reuse so much language, and we understand the nature of this language and situated cognition, and it makes sense that there shouldn't be, it's not the same mechanism of the open-ended question. It may not be the same mechanism anyway as like normal language creation, where we talk around a thing to carve it out. We're now talking about directional things to find something. It's a different kind of language thing we're looking for, a query language. And that basically, through doing a study, we found that was the case, that through collecting these forms over years, we started realizing that it's called landing the plane in development, basically, that there's less and less new things. Like there may still be some stragglers, but it got harder and harder to find unique forms, there were not that more and more, as you keep looking for examples of open-ended forms, you can map them into this model, and then you can start to see how that takes shape, and that it's not infinitely many forms, and that basically revealed as a closed system of reason with processes between something like a calculus of reason. So it's I think I misspoke that second to last bullet point. So yeah, no, I didn't. Okay, so physical equations, the equations we're familiar with, math that we use, what physics turned into, objective facts, the math of what we can observe out there and share observations about, our objective truth, is like a calculus of reason against physical systems. And then we can say this is a similar kind as a calculus of reason that we use for living systems, for what actually the models of change within living systems. So calculus out there, models of change of physical systems, process physics, the language forms in here reveal the calculus of change for living systems. What changes inside living systems that change the livingness. And so that's what we came up with, is that there was so each line was kind of this process, and it could be many. This is just a auto-generated map that came from the system. So each line, is there if there was a form of interaction. And basically, this is how, and you'll see this in a minute, this is how this is a model of change. So it's how each category on each side can change each other. So yeah, so I'll get back to that in a second. And then we talked about briefly implications, which we're still not going to get to now, and maybe we'll have to come back to later. But basically, that that there's a lot to say about what this enables. Basically, like what open questions out there in the liminal web this can answer. That people still consider open questions, and I wouldn't necessarily consider open questions anymore. So I think it'll be worth at some point getting back to what are the possibilities, what are the implications of saying that this is a closed system of reasoning, and to see what's outstanding questions that addresses. And okay, so now I want to what I want to do next is try to clarify a little bit of what I think was confusing the first time I went through this, because I think that looking at this, people would think, because it's like categories with lines, that this is a trapping system. So I think there's some questions of like, well, now are you trapped in this system? What is fundamentally different here? Isn't this also a system of categories? And how does it not trap you? And the way I would try to visually represent this is to think of each of these categories as being what I showed in the integrated left-right hemisphere as revealing envelopes of plausibility. They're emergent, transient things that livingness is made out of. This is very abstract, but you see the image on the right. Each of these categories I'm showing is made up of a bunch of lines, and there's no there there. So that is very much like the carving out envelopes of plausibility. Made up of what? Made up of other things carved out of envelopes of plausibilities. So this is describing the nature of a fabric, and that each of these categories is, what is it? It is all the processes that connect it to every other category. It's not, they're not things. They are emergent envelopes construed out of every process that happens to be relevant in a given context. And I think this, so I think I did this, well, let me just try. Yeah, so in some sense, another way to think about this is when you work with these categories and you realize that they all have possibility for change, and they're all change-based categories, and you start to see how they are, like start working with them and see how they're made up of all the other categories, that process reveals their intrinsic empty nature, and reveals kind of what we hear both from physics and we hear from mystics about the idea, and Buddhists, the idea of this implicit emptiness to all things, no thingness, the process philosophy, and so on. What it's saying is that thingness that we see, those envelopes of plausibility, if you want to think about the physics of it, they're all transients. But if you think about, if you step back and we say, okay, what's the most concrete thing you come up with that's absolutely a thing? It'd be like a rock, right? It'd be like a rock's like the most solid as a rock, or a mountain, right? But if we lived for 1 billion years, that would be fluid, and we'd be vapor. So these are transients on different time scale. So everything that reifies has a time scale where it's transient. We just vibe with, or we just productively interface with, or we operate on our time scale as living things. It's productive for us to know what things aren't going to change very quickly, because that's how we can really orient. That's super high leverage, you know. But understanding that, but if we get carried away with that and assume that everything is like that because it's the most useful, then we can find ourselves trapped and not seeing all kinds of possibilities in our lives. Basically, we miss the move that living systems and are adaptive and fluid, and have the ability to dynamically change these categories for themselves. And I'm saying that this is our superpower, that when we're dealing with dead systems, not living systems, the kind that we've reified in the Western world, the kind we're used to, the parts to whole, the kind we engineer with, the kind we govern with, we have systems of rules, and that they have the problem we talked about last time of increasing exponentially when they're decontextualized, because they have to be decontextualized, and that decelerates our ability to think with them in open systems, because they are always relevant. They start piling up. We feel like we start getting burdened with this idea that everything is relevant all the time, and we cannot seem to get a break from it, and we get completely overwhelmed. Whereas when we deal with constraints, which is what our natural cognition works with, tied to dynamic, open, feasible, contextual envelopes of plausibility, the more constraints we bring in, the more things we bring in, the smaller the envelope of plausibility becomes, the fewer, the less decision fatigue, the faster our cognition. And that envelope shrinks and our thinking gets simpler, and we basically get faster at it, and we actually do massive data compression. So this is our superpower, and this is what makes us attuned for the times that are coming. We've actually been kind of fighting with one arm tied behind our back and using the wrong tool for the job. For the, we were accustomed to these brittle systems, rule-based systems, and now we're trying to shift into this kind of dual, these constraint-based ways of thinking. And here I'm showing, I think last time is a bit confusing. I was trying to show on the right that little blue thing's like the envelope of plausibility. And in our rules-based system, where we're trying to optimize, we may say, oh, which one? And in the natural intelligence system, it says it doesn't matter. They're all just anything plausible will do. We're not picky. It's about plausibility and feasibility, because as we start to narrow the constraints, just finding any way forward is life. Life is always just happy to find any way forward. And as we know, more, eventually it won't find a way forward. So we're just continually reinventing ourselves and finding a way forward, reinventing ourselves and finding a way forward until we can't anymore. Optimization, everything's static, and now all of a sudden we're doing this very different process. So again, this is very abstract, but I'm just trying to maybe feed your imagination to start to get more around this. So I'm kind of showing that in a sense, in a real system, you'd have multiple of these categories coming together, carving out that blue dot in the center on the left as like an envelope of plausibility, if that helps anyone visualize that. And that these things in the left two images kind of have this concept, finding all this interesting string art of thinking about these constraints that come in as being ever present. And I think I have it on this slide. Okay, sorry, no, I don't. So, so what do I mean by that? So the constraints are ever present. What changes is their relevance, their proximity. And basically that's an ever shifting, almost like that you can think of it as ever shifting fabric that reveals transient envelopes of plausibility, but the strings or relations are ever present. They just may not be relevant. So gravity is so constraints like the fundamental forces are good intuitive way to think about this. Gravity is always relevant. Gravity is ever present. It's an ever present constraint between everything and everything else in the universe. You can't destroy it. It's always true. It's always there. It's just not relevant for us right now, except for the moon and the earth. That's the only gravity that's really relevant to us, even though it's all still there. Everything can change. At some time a meteor would come, or something can happen, and now we have to consider more gravity, right? And so basically the relations there, the circumstances and life changes that make those constraints more relevant in our given context. And we have that felt sense about everything. When we do these envelopes of plausibility, all we have to do is bring things into our imaginative workspace, and we have a felt sense of all these different relations that have us reveal what those envelopes are. We get it for free. But that's one thing to think about, is it's like all strings and voids and no they're there. And so yeah, on this one. So here's some more fun examples of string art I found to help maybe people start to conceptualize how these shapes, I wish there's an animation, but how we have these shapes, these different constraints come in, we reify different things in our lives, they become the new envelopes of plausibility in those categories. And in a sense, as we're going through these inquiry forms, what we're doing is trying to move things around so that we can find those envelopes of plausibility that way through. We're rotating, we're moving the whole highly dimensional space to see where things line up and reveal the envelopes of plausibility. It's kind of like an escape room where there may be clues everywhere. We're looking for anything that doesn't add up. We have all these cognitive senses that kind of guide us and say, oh, I think this might be a way out. And that we're constantly testing and looking for ways out of ways our attention might be trapped, our situation might be trapped our life may not be viable, and we've got to innovate our way out of our current situation through insight, through ways of looking. And this yet another visual, maybe to help people have it kind of lock in, that if you were to take these kind of negative space concepts, these transient reified things, and reify them and say that this is a real thing, that like reify them in such a sense that you say that this is the only thing that matters, and start to ignore what they emerge from, and then ask about their causal relations between them, you can build up, this is kind of the mechanism of that, creating a closed system. And then basically, once you remove it out of the context it's embedded in, now you have one of these abstract systems that can serve as a spawner of parasitic processes and whatnot, and basically the things that can capture your attention. And then of course the restorative move would be to kind of try to reverse that, where you bring it back in, you start to reveal the context, you start to see the emptiness, and you start to understand that each of these strings is something that can be moved, can be plucked, we're dynamic, it's a fabric, it can change, and changing any of those strings one place can change it everywhere. So there's fabric-like experience. It's kind of the felt sense of lateral thinking, that we're thinking outside of that complex, we're thinking outside of what appears to be solid by virtue of it being this revealed envelope. But then as we start to look at all the things that contribute to it, and testing how each of those are changeable, we start to see how the shape of that thing can change or even go away. Okay, so that was a bit of a whirlwind there. So now I'm going to go through some more examples, hopefully that will still help all this kind of gel. So last time I talked about how you can use natural language to take a representative bit of writing. For those that are curious, this writing, we just asked Mechanical Turk testers to share with us what's been bothering them. And we were kind of saddened actually by, people are having a hard time out there. That was during the pandemic as well, I believe. But anyway, so this is real examples from people out there in the world. And then as I mentioned before, we wrote a natural language processor, just looking at these closed classed words that would just try to look for people pointing at these categories. And so each of those colored dots, the colors correspond to a different category type. And you can look at this a different way, where I just list them all. And just to give you an idea, that paragraph and a half of text or whatever, just back at, ballpark, our algorithm came with like about 63 guesses for places you could start exploring across multiple categories. So each of these might be possibilities for change. And the reader, the writer could skim these, for instance, and would have a sense like that, like the escape room. Hey, does that wall not quite fit? Or is that maybe there's a clue over there? I have a sense there's something there. There's a felt sense you get when you use your cognitive senses of like, oh, maybe that is a place that changes. And that's kind of what you're following with these guesses. That's what you're maybe trying to active listen for in yourself. If you aren't using a natural language processor, is what maybe someone else is trying to do for you. So this is like you're trying to reveal which of these things feel like they're not so tightly bound, or that there's that curiosity, that interest in exploring deeper. And as we teach in our course, these cognitive senses are very reliable, and curiosity, as people that research curiosity say, it's a reliable indicator that you're about ready to have you're close to an insight. Your mind's telling you, I think I have a way to put these things together. Let me go investigate. Let me go fill my mind with these things because I think something's going to click. And that is like a drive we have of like, I'm ready to reconstruct this. I need you to let me go fill my cognitive workspace with this thing I feel curiosity about. So really lean into following that sense. Okay, so this is an example just to give an idea of how open the process would be just with yourself, natural writing. And now I want to contrast this, and so let me step back for a second here. So these would be like starting points, and then you basically could pick a category, and then you would have multiple inquiries that would lead you to related categories. As we said, each category is made up of other categories. So you can start to hop through, choose your own adventure through things you think have possibility for change across all the categories. So you can kind of imagine your number of possibilities are growing with each time you kind of follow one to the next category. So let me show an example. Let me show an example of that where someone else chose for people. So what this is this is a sample of a group format that is practiced in over 30 countries. 2 million people are using this process. And this is their mapping onto these categories. This was the process that they walk people through. So they start with the first step. They have some goal instance, some goal that they're trying to have in the world collectively, and they ask people what are the challenges associated. So in that first step, you can see I start with the red circle, which is where we're starting. And all these diagrams I can do the same way. The red circle is where I'm starting, then an arrow of where I'm going through an inquiry or a lens-like hop, something that's lensing into the next category. So blue is where we're going. So they go from a goal category in the red to a challenge category down there in the green. That's the first move, red to blue, from the goal to the green dot challenge category. Now people are thinking about not the goal, they're thinking about the challenges, all kinds of challenges. And they chose that out of potentially we have on the order of like 24 ways of looking, or different lenses, ways they could have chosen to hop from that, but they chose that one. And now they asked, given these challenges, how do these challenges, the whole of them, make you feel? So now they went from a collection of things, challenges, where you have to average across that category. You can't do each category individually. You have to average across them into how they feel. So they're reifying how do challenges feel in general. So now they reified, so they went in the second move from challenges to state. That's the little wiggly guy, that's a state. So from challenges to state is the next move. And now they selected that. First, they reified the collection, and then within that, they only selected one of the 24 moves. And now in the state category, they said, what do you do when you feel that way? So now they've reified all the states that can be associated with challenges into behavior category. And now here they selected one from 27 of possible ways of looking that we can imagine. So if you do the math on this, you get, or back of the envelope, if you assume that there's just looking at categories, not looking at the lenses, just looking at the category hops. If you assume that there's about 5 aspects for category and you ignore 11 other categories, I guess I should say 10. Okay, you get on your order 50, and then you now hop and you're ignoring all the next level possibilities. You're basically selecting out of 3,000 second degree aspects that are possibilities for change. So basically the first one we're ignoring 9 or 10 or 11, we could say the same category could change. So we're ignoring 11 categories of change. And then each time we're ignoring the 11 out of the 12 categories of change. So now we're second degree categories of change. That's all the things that could have changed the category we hop to. And then we do it again. So we're doing 3 degrees removal from the original thing, looking for categories of change that change the thing, that change the thing. So now that gets us, we could have looked at 160,000 potential third degree aspects and over 2 million inquiry forms if we really were fully fleshing out through 2 hops, which is a lot, every possible mechanism of change to arrive at our goal. And so when you look at this, what happened. They revealed, first off, they revealed a model of change. They revealed a model of change, and then they reified it and moved a group through this model of change. And if you're noticing, so the model of change looks like, when you have a goal, figure out what the challenges are. When you have those challenges, see how they make you feel. When you have those feelings, what do you do with those feelings? And the funnel of looking for solutions is moving towards the action is coping. So you start coping with the challenge, which doesn't address the goal. So you actually don't address the goal. Your action is to address your feelings about the challenges with the goal. And and in a sense, so you might think, wow, that's so odd in a way, like, like that's so like why would you go from a goal to but if you had experienced it, you would notice that what's happening is there's a lot of side effects going on, a lot of other things going on in the process that kind of obfuscate that or hide that this is this, and there's lots of things like this where other things are happening, social effects are happening, shared vibing of emotions happening, people are having catharsis, all kinds of things are happening, but they are kind of hiding this implicit change model. And so that's kind of the hidden potential harm by omission we talked about last time, that there can be implicit harm by omission if you give people a sense that this is the way that you should work through a collective goal, because it ultimately, this particular move leaves you disempowered towards the goal, but empowered in theory towards changing your state or coping with your feelings, which is what they're measuring against. That's their outcomes. So it's probably not, they may not have realized they selected for that. But if you're a psychological intervention, your outcome you're measuring for is better emotional state, then you would select for this workflow starting, it would be kind of self-selecting. I don't know if that was part of it, but this gives an example. So this is an example of where you can deconstruct any system where the questions are made explicit and kind of just start to look at, are they staying on the category, or they have completely jumped to another category? Did they reify that category? Did they collapse it statistically so that now they've lost information? What are the different moves they're doing? And start to see how many possibilities are being removed by accidental collapsing of possibilities without becoming aware of that. And then last time, maybe this helps ground a little bit. I think this is a little bit hard to follow. That that was a 3-step process, but let's say it was a 5-step process. This is the thought experiment I did last time. Let's say it was 5 questions, and it doesn't have to be hopping categories, just 5 questions, 5 lenses that people are doing into things or ways of looking or inquiry forms, a sequence of 5 of them like that. That's part of a process that's deployed in the world. If you want to just do the raw numbers on how many of those can, how many of those there can be, are back of the envelope saying with just common sense categories that you could construe those multiple step processes up to 10 to the 24, which is on the order for 1 trillion. Each person could innovate 1 trillion of them without overlapping. So this is starting to point at 2 things, right? It's pointing out a problem, but it's also pointing out what John Vervaeke speaks of as the relevance realization problem, that you need a way to select, and we're arguing that the selector is context, that being aware of this, it'll become apparent, that it'll become apparent in the context how to select. The context in our, is what provides the constraints to show us. So it's not to say that it has to, so it's not to say it stays overwhelming. It's saying that by making this transparent, we can start to see problems and we can start to improve these processes. And so I'll do a few more examples, and the next one, CBT. So this is like one of our top, in America anyway, our top interventions for people who are in psychological distress. And the change model of CBT is to look at beliefs. Beliefs are the ideas that you have thoughts or belief forms that are problematic, and so that you can change them because they're just beliefs. And so you challenge them. And so you reify beliefs into a different belief. You improve your beliefs, and that's the little belief category over there. So you go from some set of beliefs to some new and improved set of beliefs. And the idea is that you're being irrational, so you can use a rational process. And as if you recall, that the idea that you can understand what's rational and irrational logically is the domain of the lower level cognitive system. The higher level cognitive system doesn't work like that. It works through blends. So this is a rational process to try to correct a set of beliefs with another set of beliefs. This is based on a 1970s thesis that this is the root cause of psychological distress. And it's been shown to evidence anyway to not hold up, that by virtue of the fact that when people looked for the signal of rationality, they found that that when people are more psychologically distressed, they're more rational. And this is the work of Johnson Laird, and that was popularized a few years ago. People may have been aware of this work where they were looking at people that had OCD, where I'd say, well, why are you washing your hands? Well, because I'm afraid I'll get a disease. And it's like, well, that's true, you could get a disease. And if you took people with these various types of distress, like if people that were had social problems, and you asked them to think through social scenarios, they could predict social outcomes better. And if they were, if you basically gave them a rational problem in the same domain where they experienced psychological distress, their thinking was enhanced and their ability to predict rationally was increased. So this is where Johnson Laird came up with the model of the hyper-emotional theory that basically is what is agrees very well with the McGilchrist model, which is basically that when you can identify a loop in the thinking, a ruminative causal loop in the thinking that has a negative valence, you build a feedback mechanism. You become like this negative resonator, and that's the downward spiral that we see with psychological mental illnesses and extreme psychological distress. Is that it's a closed causal network where everything is true within a rational, logical framework. But what's missing is that it's not relevant. Like if all you're doing is washing your hands every minute to not get a disease, that is true. That will keep you from getting a disease, but that is not the relevance of your life. That is not what a living system would do. That is missing the context you're living within. That would start to break up that behavior and start to understand that it lives in a larger context where it's not the most, it's not trapped. It doesn't trap your attention. And just as kind of a demonstration of the failure of this approach, I think that everyone's had to kind of back off from this, but a few years ago, there was an attempt to make AI chatbots that would basically be able to identify the mistaken thinking and dialogue with people based on rules-based and pattern recognition based on these kind of causal models. And I'll just let people read this for themselves. I'll give you all to read this for yourself. And this was, I think these are systems that have been backed by some of the lead thinkers in AI. Here's one more. So this is examples of what the AIs can't do. They cannot bring in the context, the common sense to understand the inappropriateness of these comments. It's not how they're designed. So I thought we'd quickly go through, I don't know how this is going to go, but I thought I would just, this is an experiment. This whole talk's an experiment. This part's the most experimental part. So, so this is see if anyone can identify any systems. And if you can put it in the chat or raise your hand that whose model of change is to go from one state to another state. Or you can just shout out any examples you think are the model of change is to start with a state that's problematic and change it to another state. So I don't see, don't think there's any, is there anybody? I realize I can't see in my, I can't see if there's anybody in the chat. Has anybody put anything in the chat? Okay. So systems that tend to.
Susan unmuted. She had
Oh,
share.
okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure what you're asking for. I mean, I guess what came to mind was the judicial system, but I don't think that's what you're asking for.
So this is, yeah, this is basically looking at models of change. Like, so when we're in psychological distress, right? And we're saying, okay, there's something wrong with us. What do we do? So we're saying a natural intelligence system, when it's under any kind of distress, or when it's when it's bothered or something doesn't add up, it will try to change one of these categories. This is it'll use one of these processes to examine opportunities for change. Some systems would say that you only need to look at the category of state. Like, you only need to look at your state information and change that to address any kind of distress. And so I guess my guessing thing didn't really work. I think I didn't probably set this up very well, but the examples I had prepared or thought of were our drug model for psychiatric drugs. That basically, that if we believe there's a chemical imbalance in the brain, we can just change that state to solve the problem of psychological distress. We wouldn't have to change other things. We could just change our state that way. We may also want to do different types of self-regulation, meditation, things like this, or attempting to, oh, go ahead, Peter, you have some ideas?
Yeah, like neuro-linguistic programming, like Tony Robbins stuff. Would that fall under the state change modality?
I think that's belief change. Am I right about that? So anyone else know I think that falls into.
That's mainly state change. I'm trained in NLP.
So the NLP, can you explain how that works?
Well,
as a state change?
Like for instance, a technique would be to step away from the problem.
Mm-hmm.
Get space with the problem. There's a lot of different techniques, but and they, the underlying philosophy is that people have their resources. We just have to find them.
Mm-hmm.
So I think what you've got is even more powerful, because I like the model in the sense of, whenever you're working with a coach, you're going to be constrained, and most coaches are going to put their own projections, their own mental models into your space. And so that's the difference between clean language. But
Right.
But you're allowing, what I see this as is training people to become being able to be independent instead of dependent on an exterior source, which I think is much more powerful and practical today.
Cool, thank you. Yeah, I think that this was the high risk of doing this kind of this mapping thing live. I think that there's each of these systems probably deserves more than a cursory glance. They're and very few probably perfectly mapped down to one mechanism just like this, but I think you could maybe think of it more of like a dominant mode. So like, so maybe a dominant mode of a lot of meditation is to change your state. A dominant mode of, well, this drugs is probably the most direct, like there's just one mode with drugs, right? With the psychiatric drugs, you're just changing your state, and they're quite clear about that. That is the change, mechanism. So yeah, the idea here isn't to necessarily demonize any one thing. It's to kind of show how through this lens we can ask, is that the appropriate thing? Like, just to not miss possibilities. So again, back to that of like, to try to reveal if the context would suggest that there are more possibilities than what are being presented. So we'll come back to this in a minute as well, but the idea is not that you can't use these. The idea is that, which we're going to also, I'm going to give full instructions for. The idea is to, in attempting to ground them in explicating their model of change, we can look at if they missed it or if it was intentional, basically. And through grounding, we can improve them and we can address these things. Did you have another question, Susan?
Well, I just wanted to point out that that just changing your state is not going to change your situation, and just finding resources is only one part of it. You also got to understand, what the risks are and be able to evaluate the situation, which I think this really holds a lot of potential for. And I really like the. I was questioning whether there was any relationship here, but in one of the first slides, you had placed analytic intelligence as exploitive intelligence, which I'm taking that in an entrepreneurial sense. So in dynamic systems, you have to balance out the exploration with the exploitation. So I thought that was kind of a neat. I didn't know if that was something you just inserted or whether you were actually pulling from what's called dynamic systems.
Okay, yeah. So that wasn't the origin of that slide. Wasn't exploitation versus exploration as an abstraction. It was from last week's talk, and okay. I was talking about. But as interesting, if you thought about it doesn't quite map onto the exploitation model as I was using it. So I would say that's I wouldn't use it. I made it up. I wouldn't use it in that context because I think it would be confusing. What I meant to imply, and again, I made it up, was to try to explain, because I didn't know a term for it, this new recognition that when we're optimizing and we're interpreting kind of intelligence of things in the lab, like rats and humans, and we're trying to get them to perform, they're often optimizing to get the most out of a natural system. And sure. that when they are more aware of the context, you get almost emergent morality, of knowing that system, there's a reciprocity and that system's taking care of you. And so even though you'd still be wanting to exploit versus explore the berry bush, you want to eat the berries. You don't eat it in the same pattern. You don't eat as many. You're cognizant of the fact you have to leave some behind for the plant. You're much more situated. It's not this narrow, all I see you as is a resource to exploit. So maybe it would be like more map onto, if you were talking about spiral dynamics, at least if I use Ken Wilber, I-it versus I-thou relationship might be a little bit more, but I think it's more about system awareness and the awareness of the processes. If you're aware of the processes in your natural environment, you can see how things are going to play out. It becomes this dynamic. You see the envelope of plausibility is not to eat every berry. So birds have none, so there's no berries next year, and so on, right?
And I want to make sure you're not taking that the wrong way, because one, I wasn't referring to Ken Wilber's. I was referring to dynamic capabilities, which is a theory out of economics.
Oh, okay.
Which says that we have to exploit our environment. That's what we do to survive. So not exploiting other people, but,
right, exactly.
The coordination comes into play when we are able to switch between exploitation and exploration, and that's a challenge I think that we're having. Is it's the deficit model is stuck in either or when the paradox is in the and, in the switching, in the coordinating of the and the paradox. Right. So yes, I mean, so I think that this allows for the flow and the movement and the self-organizing, really. Right. the system to self-organize into a healthier form.
Yeah, the idea is that the idea is that we will do that quite naturally. We move towards that as long as we're not being trapped. Yeah, so right. That's right. And so these are we're suggesting that if one habitually goes to just one of these forums as their go-to, whenever they're in psychological distress, that's the example we have right now. There's other things you could be talking about. We could be talking about, business models and whatnot, but if we're talking about the psychological distress models right now, that people could go to these modes, that they can become, they can trap us because they won't yield. They may not yield the move we need. They may not give us the relief we want. We are not looking everywhere where things can change. So basically the problem is not the using of them. The problem is the using them at the exclusion of all the other things we could be using. And the fact that, we have a lot more possibilities available.
Yeah.
So I'll try to go through these a little bit rapidly here. Here's one I came up with where you maybe start with nothing and you choose to reify things into either identities or relationships to parts of yourself. That's a common move. This is assuming that these are useful abstractions, even if those weren't there already. And then there also might be choices about the concepts you reify into in these systems and whether or not those are allowed to be dissolved. So these are choices that can be made, that again can exclude other ways that you might be more fruitful to find a way forward. And this one, maybe the patterns became more obvious, is now the behavior category, and this will just be behavior change, that you just change a behavior. You might not need to change a behavior if you're looking at the whole model. You may say that this behavior is fine, it just doesn't work in this social context, or this behavior's fine, it's just, basically doesn't work with this person, or, like there's could be all kinds of it doesn't work with this goal, or it doesn't, like there's ways that you might realize that that the behavior is necessary perhaps, and that you need to find different context or different solution for your life, a different envelope of plausibility that accommodates it. For instance, maybe this society's wrong. There's nothing wrong with that behavior. And so that would be just looking at everything as behavior change without questioning if that's where you should be looking. And this is also a very popular one of just change yourself. So that's the identity self category, that you should just transform yourself, become enlightened, just become a better version of yourself. That you would do self-transformation as a way to address psychological distress, that you could just become more, better, some different version of yourself, just in some way that addresses everything as a strategy, instead of addressing, maybe something that's more about material conditions or something else that would maybe yield more easily. And so we may not realize that we've subscribed to this model of change either as a way to address various forms of psychological distress. And this is this one's event category. Maybe you think you need to revisit past events and reinterpret past events, or maybe everything's about past events and making sense of them, or trying to experience them differently, or do something with events, and that will be the model of change that will get you out of psychological distress. And this one might be, this is the chapters category. Maybe you think you need to create a new life for yourself. Maybe you need to go off to a monastery, or you need a new career, or you need to get a Harley Davidson and leave your wife, or whatever. You have to create a new life is the only way to solve your psychological distress, to create a new life for yourself. So we could keep going. I just picked a handful. Really, there's nothing special about these. I just wanted to try to, again, inform intuition that whether you realize or not, these choices are you're making these choices when you work with systems, and you may want to be aware if that's really, if it's not working for you, that you have other possibilities, and suggesting that this is what we hope would come out of this work, is kind of showing that there are, that these models of change can be explicated, can be revealed, can be reasoned through, and so on. And this is like extra credit here, but maybe I'll just, I think I'll just leave this one up, and if anyone can guess what this is, you can snapshot this and email me if you think you know what this is. Okay, so moving on, I'm going to try to quickly talk about how you could do this yourself if you wanted to try to do this with systems. I guess someone asks, I'd really want to know, I'm a coach and I have to consume all these things, and I really need to know, how do I reveal problems? How do I break them apart? How do I kind of try to get under the hood and figure out what is the models they're working with. What are these processes? How do I do this? And the reason you want to do this, obviously, is you do it for yourself. You want to protect yourself. You want to see, you don't want to waste your time. And of course, if you can waste a lot of time if you aren't getting anywhere. And then these things can become their own parasitic processes if anything in the models are reified and aren't allowed to change, which we didn't really go into that level of detail. But if there's presumptive things in those categories that say this doesn't change, you're not allowed to change the concepts in the category, then that can set up a closed system self, or if the mechanism can't change. So if you can see if there's confabulatory mechanisms within these systems. And the other reason is that if you start to learn how to do this deconstruction, what you learn, what starts to become revealed to you is that you can almost like deriving things from first principles and equations, like you can derive every equation you need. When you study physics, you learn how to derive every equation you need. Like you can just sit down and rederive things because you saw how all the steps go together. So after a while, you start to realize that in a lot of sense, everything out there talking to you, every person, talking about everything, they're either coming from their direct experience, which is incredibly valuable, and revealing their own tacit knowledge and their own lived experience and what they know from what they did, be they a scientist or a worker or their own life, their school hard knocks or anything. That's super valuable because we use that for the conceptual blends. And then otherwise, if they can reveal to you how they looked around and the processes, you will see the same thing they see if it's of value to you. So what people spend a lot of time doing is they go through these processes and they construe an interpretation. It could be a confabulation, a narrative through one of these pathways. And then they tell you about it through sense giving. That's what sense giving is. And so they tell you about it. And if they tell you about it in such a way that you can't unwind each of those moves and get back to the context where they pulled it from, someone's direct experience, some actual tacit knowledge, if you can't undo that move, you cannot detect bullshit. Like you cannot reconstruct, you can't throw out the good, you can't take the good from the bad. You don't have to say, okay, I see what you did there. That was some good research, but I see where you filled in, and you went too far. So, we can also do this discrimination, if we get down to this root level. So being able to deconstruct models, frameworks, being able to try to exercise those muscles, learn how to do it, not only protects yourself from stuff that can trap your attention, it also can greatly reduce the bombardment of stuff you feel like you need to consume, because you can actually get down to the root level. And this is actually the original, so let me get, anyway, so I'm saying, first off, it's a learnable skill. There is a hump to get over, and then it becomes a very fast filter, and you can start with your own life. And so you can start this deconstruction process with your own mind and see how it works and start to practice those moves using the content of your own mind. So you can train on yourself, and then that will map into training on others. But I think actually I meant to make a point on this one. I guess I thought I was making it on the next slide. So a community of practice that has to deal with this all the time is academics. So academics are very much trying to ground into each other's tacit knowledge. That's the whole point of keeping lab notebooks, of doing extensive write-ups, of giving talks, of forming these communities of practice, of viewing each other's labs, reproducing each other's experiments. They're massively trying to share each other's tacit knowledge. And so the way academics have to deal with this wall is when they're reading research papers, they say that they read them kind of the opposite as everybody else. So like a novice will say, I'm going to take your summary, your abstract, and there's entire fields of science that already know the abstract's complete BS. That's the bullshit layer. Introduction is like, well, we all know the introduction. That's where you have to nod to all the shoulders acknowledge all the shoulders you're standing on. So if you're new to a field, you would read the introduction because you want to check and maybe find seminal works, but someone who knows the field, they can throw that out. And then, and then the conclusion is like half BS, like, okay, but first, before I even bother reading anything, I can go right to the methods. I'm going to go right to the what did you actually do? And then that's going to tell me how much I need to I'll be able to imagine for myself how I'd interpret what I'm trying to get your tacit knowledge, and I'll be able to, I can reimagine and reinterpret what you did, but you show me that raw data, you show me, you explain me what you did, and I can actually reconstruct myself. I can use that. And then I might be curious to see what conclusions you drew, what hypothesis you came out of it as a domain expert, but it's really getting right to that level first. So there's this process of having to look through systems as presented that scientists do. And as I've argued previously, we are very much like natural born scientists. Scientists are leveraging our natural ability to do this higher level cognition that we're born with. So they aren't bringing anything new. They're just bringing that process into grounding it. They're better at grounding it, and they're better at they have a community where they're better at revealing that grounding. They have problems too, but it's it's a step up from how we're generally doing it today out in the wild, where we allow just about everybody to bullshit us. So step one, here we go. I'm just going to try to get through these quickly here. So basically, as I already mentioned, you want to get to the methodology, and again, ignore all sense giving. It doesn't even matter how they explained how their system works, or like look at CBT. Why it works is there's all kinds of things happening in a CBT session that aren't that 1970s thesis, right? There's all kinds of things happening so if you're going to go back to the theory of why it worked, you may want to ignore that, and you need to go directly to what is actually happening in the room and what's going on. So first you have to figure out what's actually going on, what's the direct experience. And it also can be origin stories. Where did it come? If it's what were the original stories that led to the system, and then the methodology and all of that. So you want to get right down to the grounding. And at this level, you can find systematic and methodological problems. You can find wrong context problems. Like if you get down to that level, like we're saying, knowing that the original 1970s Beck hypothesis about CBT was so wrong gave me a grounding to really be on the lookout of okay, well, then why does this work? So you don't have to necessarily throw it out, but it can give you enough wrong context problem that you will be suspicious, and you'll be looking, upstream for problems, or can completely negate the relevance. So often you can find that something was done in a completely different social context that's not relevant, and you can see that. So that was a lot of the criticism with the weird studies, that basically when you try to recreate a lot of studies with underprivileged children or young adults, that they don't reproduce because it's a totally different social context. And then you can start to see, okay, I could have predicted that just in my imagination, seeing where are you getting your sample, where are your study participants from, and grounding into direct experience. So the next thing is, you can track back their science and models they're referencing. And then this is, if you're going to go the science route, and that's back to where you'd want to identify the seminal works, try to read the methodology there, get as deep as you can into it, and then go back upstream, because you're going to go back in time, then go forward in time and try to find criticisms of the seminal works, and then find criticism of the criticism of the criticism, on, and flesh out that branch. It usually doesn't go that deep, so that you can try to get at both sides of the argument. And again, all those digging into tacit knowledge, if you want to try to vet the model. And now you've kind of gotten, if the thing's still alive, it still seems like, okay, this is still relevant, something I want to work with. Then look at their activities, their inquiries, their metaphors. Basically, you're trying to look for what their change model is. What's their model of change? And you're still ignoring all the sense giving. Assume it's nonsense, or it doesn't matter at this point, because you will be able to rederive whatever this is what you're going to get at, whether you like it or not. You can start to look at what's actually happening versus what they're saying is happening. So you want to get at what are they actually doing. And you might find here, confabulations, you might find mapping errors, the wrong metaphors, wrong constraints, wrong boundary conditions. And then you can know everything downstream will be wrong if they've done any of that, or that doesn't apply. Wrong meaning not applicable to your context. So you're really just trying to see, you've got an idea of using this in a context. Does this context apply? And you're looking for clues for where there might be invalidations. And then I was going to comment that we're looking at just the inquiry and the change model. This is, I'm not going to go into this right now, it's something we teach in our course, but basically this is the natural intelligence cycle, ignore the word with, that we teach that, and there's a circle with all these things hanging off it. That's this complex we point out of all these things we do to just try to work with the nebulosity of our mind to get it to where it's articulatable into the model. And that can be the bulk of what a lot of systems do as well. So you may not even get to a process model. You might just be dealing with how do they handle the nebulous, how they help people move from the nebulous to reified to expressed. And that can be, all kinds of, somatic movement, tantra, meditation, bodywork, yoga, emotional release, different forms of expression. And then the mechanism there is novelty, because you're basically you're basically trying to bring novel things into the, if you're trying to do a mechanism of change, I'm just going to be doing other things for other benefits. But if you're trying to look for a change model, you would be looking at what is all that potentially reifying or enabling to arise, what containers allow arising, what kinds of things, and then capture those. And now that everything is explicated, you can map it into categories, any categories that seem relevant. You can look at the processes they're using once you've got it categorized against other categories. And this is where you can start to look at their change model. And you can see how, in retrospect, if you do some of these, you'll see how anything worth, like I said, anything worth sense giving around their model will be apparent, and anything that isn't apparent probably won't be very helpful. And a lot of it could be justification of confabulatory mechanisms. And again, so many systems work based on legitimate subgraphs, all these possible subgraphs of this hypergraph of some subset of 1,000 processes that we curated together into this, that's what they are. Like, we curated from all these things into this thing, and they're going to have valid subsets. So a lot of it also is just going to be validating some subset of valid processes, but they are still, they may or may not have been correctly curated for the context. They may have been perfectly curated for the context. When they're curated for a context that maps onto your context, that's beautiful. That's a shortcut, and that's worthwhile. So that is that is mapping the tacit knowledge. That's the grounding. So you're looking for the disconnect is the main thing. Overgeneralization, disconnect, omission, and confabulation. So these are like the main dimensions you'd be looking for to try to improve models you're working with. I think I just said that. Should have advanced the slide. So yeah, category errors. Those are some of the things I was mentioning before, where people, you could see the change model would have worked better if they chose a different category. Presumptions on the concepts that people are gonna assume this is the concept, assume something's the mechanism. They may also do a statistical model where they don't have a mechanism. They just say, I don't know, it just changes, and that's all you need to know is the statistics. And those are also dubious for everything we talked about, historically, that you don't know what's coming if you don't know the mechanism. And assumptions about reification. So yeah, can this thing dissolve? Can this category dissolve? Is this automatically a bad behavior? Or is this, this kind of thing? Is this automatically the wrong identity? Is this automatically the wrong belief? Is maybe a belief can be generalized into a truth, because that is someone's truth is a generalized sounding belief. My groundable example, which I might have been able to trip up some of those AIs, would be like, I'll never be able to jump to the moon. I'm always stuck to the earth, only be able to jump as high as I, under a couple feet. No, always, never statements. It's like, well, no, I was mapping that into, real world constraints that are based on processes. And in that case, I can, the best I can do is without what, but within the context of my life, that's a reasonable generalization. That's a reasonable generalization for this context that becomes more like a truth. You cannot deny me that. I see that to be true, for instance. So, so this is the idea, is that you can use these processes to try to correct these models. And then the one thing that we didn't touch on that are problems that we're going to talk about next week would be social problems. So there's a lot of ways social effects can affect these systems. And so that's going to be easier. That's a whole kind of different cross cut into this world that's actually easier to think about, but we'll do a different pass on that when we're looking at social effects. But if you're just looking at the model itself in this context, this can help you start to reveal problems. And so some implications of all this, I was actually turned on by a couple people. One person in this room of the clean language movement asked my thoughts on it. I don't know a lot about it, but I read a little bit so far. And I can see the idea, I think that they're rightfully recognizing is that there's a lot of ways to guess wrong, that if you guess wrong, you can be creating, you know, all kinds of problems for people, and you have to be careful about guessing. And so you are in this kind of guessing bind where you either have to not guess or guess everything, which is not really possible conversationally, or somehow magically guess well. So this is a little bit of a bind about guessing. And this tends to neuter a lot of ways people can interact with each other cleanly, because they have to kind of just stay very nebulous. Like they can't really get in there and start to help people probe mechanisms. So one idea here is that the implications would be that if you can be explicit about a cheat sheet, you know, you can guess everything. That might enable people to get over this suggestibility problem. And if you have the right forms, so that this is this would help maybe with expand the purview of people being able to help each other without introducing these kind of problems. And this came up before, like, well, okay, we're looking at all these systems, you know, that might come up naturally, like, well, do we need any of them? Can we just do them all from scratch? And we can't. I'm arguing you could build systems on the fly for everything, but you also can reuse them if you understand the context, and you can share them and you can curate them. And so that would be our vision, would be to democratize and curate and just clean up a little bit this idea that this practice of just grounded in tacit knowledge. So I used growing tomatoes as like this super simple example where, you know, there's probably a handful of dimensions to explore growing tomatoes, but they're different everywhere. So the forms might be of general use, but the context will change. And if you're growing them in the tropics or you're growing them in the Arctic, everyone seems to want to grow tomatoes, and growing them in this kind of soil and that kind of soil. So, you know, permaculture is this interesting, you know, you have these global dimensions or global ways of looking that might be helpful. But the nice thing is people can test, can share, and at least be transparent. And if someone finds a process that is useful, they can measure it, they can test it, they can share it, and they can help accelerate other people's sense-making process and overcome the hump of trying to find, you know, what could be helpful, especially when you're in a time squeeze. So the only caveat is no one can claim the ring of like God's eye view. And everyone has to say, this is, you know, the context. And so coming back again, the idea would be to catch up with 20th century psychology, which was somewhat irresponsible for creating endless models that were not grounded. This explosion of models, that this cleanup, and this could use, I offer this could be an intuitive way to try to clean up and integrate and map out what they all are, and try to navigate them, or, you know, start to make sense out of how would you unify them all, and come up with any kind of framework to move forward there. So there's kind of that burden on anybody claiming the God's eye view, and that has been well, I'm going to talk about that next, but the other part of this is the sense givers. If we lived in a culture where everybody had this, understood this, and were thinking this way, kind of seeing the matrix and wanting to get underneath the code and get underneath the bullshit, that there would be a higher bar for sense givers in the media in general, as a subset of sense givers, and anybody who is attempting to be a sense giver. And that's even people that are calling themselves sense makers, but are actually sense giving, like that there's going to be a lot more homework, you know, to allow people to check your work, a lot more accountability there. And that there would be this elevation of domain-specific tacit knowledge, that people's direct experience would be elevated. And we kind of talked about that in education slide from last time, that basically that this would be, that when you contextualize things, tacit knowledge is king, useful. That is the source we use to find the ways, to find the plausibility, that we can use other people's experiences to see possibilities for ourselves we didn't see ourselves. And in many ways, that's what's understood a therapist is trying to do, is be a proxy for that. They're a professional proxy for a world of possibilities, which is a big demand to put on a therapist. So, and it's, it's obviously not, has all kinds of problems we talked about last time, of this time crunch and how difficult that's like an impossible burden to put on somebody, to have the God's eye view on someone else's behalf. Like what magic and immense cognitive work they're trying to do on someone else's behalf. So there would be more importance put on grounding the tacit knowledge, trying to understand how to create a network of tacit knowledge, and trying to understand how to bring together people that can truly give the grounded, at least, always a partial map, but the necessary partial map so people can reconstrue and re-understand new possibilities for life. So tacit knowledge becomes a source of future thinking, hope, and agency, as Jerome Frank had framed it. I really like that framing, that is what the assumptive world that you're trying to give somebody, this new world of possibilities, can be. But if it's grounded in someone's lived experience, that becomes way more powerful than having someone trying to proxy that for you. Like if you really know someone else like walked in your shoes and they're 50 years older than you, or, that becomes a rock, and you also have a source of being able to fill in more, and you're smart enough to know the overlap. You're smart enough to do the blend like we talked about, to figure out the parts that are useful and the parts to throw away. We're all smart enough to do that. So yeah, there'd be an empowering of helping fields around this, to gain the tacit knowledge, to have a framework where they could start to measure these processes and curate their own and justify this work they did to do that on other people's behalf. So it's, in some ways, it'd be democratizing helping, where it's particularly where there's no tacit knowledge tied to the training, which is what the therapists have that problem right now, is they cannot tie tacit knowledge to their training. When they do more training, they don't do their job better by the way they measure their job. And that's a known problem in the field. So, if that's the case, then I think that the ethical implications of that in a mental health crisis, we look hard at that and consider that, what this helping people need can be democratized, and people are looking at this into community peer models and taken away and removed from the professional model unless you can show what that tacit knowledge need is. So with doctors, there's an obvious tacit knowledge need. And if there's a true biological kind of illness going on, or whatever, if you want to call it a mental illness, then you have to show that you can treat it better than somebody else. And then that would be the nature of it being a tacit knowledge tied profession. And that is a problem right now and should be addressed ethically. And this is what Susan said on our behalf, that that we also think that this would be easy to train people. This is not as hard as algebra, to say here's a bunch of questions, it's a model that you can, if you're stuck, here's a bunch of ways you can look around in your life and know. Just don't believe anybody if they tell you these things can't change. Nothing's easy. It may not be easy, but you can challenge each of these categories and say, is there a way to change each one? And anyone that thinks those categories don't change, don't realize how many people are choosing to change all of them at once category. People opt out of life. They say, I'm going to change all of them, watch me. So if you don't give people opportunities for change, they will pick the biggest change. They'll choose the biggest change model we don't want them to pick. So I think that this is essential, that people know they have lots of options, that there's lots and lots of options, and how, if these options aren't working, invent your own. You can do that. You're a naturally intelligent person. The higher level cognitive skills that tie to wise reasoning are independent of IQ, age, gender, ethnicity, every measure they can find, socioeconomic status, independent of all of them. And the way to understand that is that when you look around and you're making sense of what I say, and you look around a room at the same time, you can get up and go get a glass of water. Like, that's ingenious. And that's all you need, is those basic capacities that any person can do to do this kind of blending and sifting and the grounding problem of construing what's real and what's bullshit in your world. So basically this can be completely democratized, and then with technology and training, people can also, if they want to, we would argue it's a good thing to do. It's a very interesting thing to do, start curating their own models, realizing they can own that. They can own those categories, they can curate them. And in doing that, they open up a whole world of metacognitive insight and revealing of that empty nature talked about, things that people have celebrated normally wouldn't be able to achieve without in-depth and exotic meditation practices, should become just emergent and obvious through through working with these categories and not spending most of our lives in this trapped state. And so we might expect measurable changes culturally that start to reflect this, that maybe are likely what people are pointing at when they look at cultural differences in measured wisdom. And Americans are much lower in wisdom than other cultures, for instance, and we have habitually the foreground versus background attention trapping when we, that we have cognitive habits that can start to dissolve and have a different relationship to our own perceptual framework. Okay, so that's it. And I did go over a bit. And so, yeah, next week I'm going to attempt to ground this into what does a community of practice look like that where each practitioner, if their attention gets trapped, they'll die. And they know it. Where trapped attention is deadly. A community of practice where they know that trapped attention is deadly. And that is, as I think I've foreshadowed a few times now, I'm going to be looking at the paragliding, cross-country paragliding, where you are navigating the skies invisibly without a motor, just with fabric and string in a very dynamic, deadly fluid, the system. And where your ability to reconstrue and make sense out of a very complex invisible environment and innovate is you're relying on in this sport. And with seconds, you have seconds often to get yourself out of a jam. You need to be able to think very quickly. And so it's a true test of how a community trains where if your attention gets trapped in those seconds, you'll die. So there's a lot of meta talk about what those forces are, the naming of them, how the community practices and trains against it. There's a lot of storytelling around what that is like. And then I participated in this community of practice for years. I actually was able to fly on the US team and kind of the equivalent of the Air Sport Olympics back in the 90s. And so I actually have my own second windows where I had to do some really hard cognitive tasks. And so I will be trying to explicate what I did in the same way I showed those diagrams. I'm going to go through my own brain and try to show you my versions, the CBT and everything else will be, what do I think my brain was doing in order to do all the moves to readjust, to not only do conceptual blends, but to untrap my attention and basically be able to do what needed to be done to innovate and apply my full natural intelligence, and how fast that could be done. So I think so it's gonna be some storytelling, and then also around the community that supports it, the practices in that community, how people approach it as a really, I think, a very nice metaphoric system for what we might be stepping back into. I also think it's a great model system because the participants are very, very much from this culture or from Western civilization culture. They come from a set of habits and they need to unlearn all that. And that's part of the training. I've also trained people. I've been a coach in this sport. And so, there's the arc of how do you actually get people to move into this way of being. So I think there's a lot of nice ways we could think about what a future might look like of adopting these in communities of practice and what emerges, which I think is also going to be people have spoken to, and the religion, it's not a religion framing of John Vervaeke, looking at in time between worlds when things are falling apart and disrupting what emerges. And so we'll see the kind of things that emerge in this community as well and map that onto a lot of the abstractions people have been talking about in these circles. So that's, I went quite long. I'm sorry about that. It was a lot to present. So we have a few minutes left for questions.
Yeah, let's give Jill a round of applause. Awesome presentation. We got a lot in today. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to close down the Zoom room soon. I have to leave. But there's two questions. So Jill, maybe you can save the chats and then we can get it to next week, or people can email you. But is there anything you'd like to leave us with to set up next week? Like anything we should prepare for? Anyone watching, if they want to come?
I don't think so. I think, it might be the lightest lift. So I think hopefully it'll be a little more, I'm just gonna be trying to reuse the old abstractions more than ever this time. This was very abstract still, just trying to get people to start to conceptualize this, and it'll be a lot easier, I think, to ground next week.
Very cool. So we're on the same link for next week if you want to attend, and if you're watching on YouTube, yeah, it'd be fun. Last session, you can come in person, and I imagine we'll have other experiments with Jill here at the STOA. And tomorrow, Robert Breedlove's coming to talk about money, Bitcoin, and freedom maximalism. So you can check that out. That's at 12 p.m. Eastern time. You can RSVP on the stoa.ca. So that being said, Jill, everyone, thanks for coming to the STOA today.